So this chapter I'm going to cover children with behavior disorders, and these can be not just a student being diagnosed with, say, ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder. In some cases, students are not diagnosed with just a behavior disorder. It's something that in most cases pops up secondary to a um, primary diagnosis. To lean back on my son, his inability to communicate uh, led to an increase in behavior. So as he got older and was trying his best to engage with his peers in quote unquote normal conversation, he would get frustrated by the looks, or people just flat out telling him, kids flat out telling him, I don't understand, or do you speak another language? When he thought at the time he was speaking just like they were, because his thought processes were basically what they were saying as well. But as I've shared before, he has a delayed speech, and he had low muscle tone in his cheeks. So, through intensive speech therapy and things that nature, and as I shared that he had a grand mal seizure that also, interesting enough, helped his speech communication because, as I shared in office hours a few weeks ago, he as his brain recovered from the grand mal seizure, his speech actually had improved, and it was an interesting thing. It did help with the behaviors a little bit, but then puberty kicked in, so then there was that. So this chapter we're going to cover what it looks like for children with behavior disorders in the educational setting. Just like in the previous chapter when we were talking about severely disabled children, um, children with severe disabilities, catching myself there. Um, there are also other terms or phrases that might be associated with a child who has a behavior disorder. And just like in everything else, you may see this on the IFSP, the IEP, or the 504 plan. We may see phrases like these that are listed here. You don't really hear people using the last three, emotional disturbance, or calling people emotionally disturbed. It just sounds horrible, right? Emotionally handicapped. You don't really hear people talking about being handicapped. They may refer to a handicapped parking spot. But as we learned in chapter 1 at the very start of this quad, handicap is not a person. It can't be a person. It is a reflection of the environment. But as time goes on and people become more aware, they are correcting themselves. But it's going to take a minute, to use a phrase that they use in the South. It's going to take us a minute as a society to stop using the word handicap inappropriately. So that's basically the basic terms that you need to know or be familiar with when it comes to children with different types of behavior disorders. So we have IDEA, and remember the IDEA stands for a law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. When it talks about an emotional disturbance, it has two main categories, and they're here, so I'm not going to read them to you, but these are things, their behavior, the child's behavior, has taken place over a significant amount of time. Here it says a long period of time. So what's long? Well, depending on what it is, if health and safety are at direct risk, of themselves or others, then of course that long period of time may be like, well, it went on for a minute or so, or it may be a situation where the teacher or the parent had to step in to keep the student from harming himself or others. But it's anything that affects their intellect. It gets to the point, the behavior gets to the point where the student can no longer learn. And it cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, meaning you're not saying, well, Johnny didn't read from the board today. Well, Johnny might be blind. So, you can't turn around and say, oh, he's emotionally disturbed. Well, no, he's frustrated because you haven't given him the material in a Braille format or giving him the material where he could just hear it. So his frustration, his behavior, his increase in destructive behaviors has to do with the materials being inaccessible to him versus someone with ODD, which my son also has, where they're lashing out simply because his case, not all, in his case, because he didn't get his way. He gets it set in his mind that he's going to do something, and then if the teacher or someone else says otherwise, then here comes this explosion of behaviors. It also can mean an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. When I was teaching special education in Florida, I had a young man who was 16 in the 7th grade, and he had been held back so many times that it was just ridiculous. And I don't mean ridiculous in his sense. I mean ridiculous because the school system failed him in the sense that they did not have a plan for him to uh, exit the K through 12 setting and exit the middle school setting, and then maybe go into a program, whether it be like homeschooling or maybe at one of the schools that deals with behaviors, so that way he can just start working towards his GED. And as a result, they just kept, because they didn't do that, they just kept holding him back in 7th grade. So here comes the behaviors. And he couldn't maintain, he did not have any respect for his mother. He didn't have any respect for any of the women at the school, including myself. And as a result, we ended up crafting a plan for him where he did most of his work with the softball coach, because he was a guy and this particular student looked up to him. So he was the first student I engaged with who had the diagnosis of oppositional defiance disorder. And basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. He's opposed to everything and he's defiant to everything until he gets his way. And so that was his way of getting out of doing his work, getting out the classroom, in some cases, even being suspended from school. And by the end of this chapter, I will have shared with everyone how suspensions and school behavior plans affect those with disabilities. Someone who has a severe behavior disorder, they may have inappropriate types of behavioral feelings under normal circumstances. It can also mean pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. Side note, people who are under the age of 18 are rarely, seldomly, barely ever diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It is not a diagnosis that clinicians want on. They will not put it on any formal paperwork, and it doesn't matter even if all the check boxes are there that scream bipolar. It's a well, how do I say? I don't want to say respected. That's the wrong word. It's a well-known thing among educators that because children's brains are still developing. They're going through puberty. I mean, that's middle school and high school right there. So how can you say that their mood changes and everything are not related to puberty, and definitely just to the things that would label it as bipolar? So it's just a term that you don't see, but you may see as a clinician, or you may see it as a teacher, or even the parent or the guardian, child care provider, these pervasive moods of unhappiness and depression, or they develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. So of course, once again, as the person watching out for the child, you want to make sure that bullying is not taking place, and you want to look at the entire child and not just hyper focus on, okay, they only act out in science class. It's like, well, what's going on before science class? Is there someone else in science class? Not saying that it's a possibility the student just doesn't like science, or maybe just doesn't like the personality of the teacher. I mean, it's everything. You can't always just hyper focus on the behavior and think, okay, well, if I punish them for not staying in their seat, then the behavior will get better. No, you need to dig a little deeper and find out what's the antecedent for the behavior, and then what can we do to change the behavior, hopefully. The term includes schizophrenia, and this, when I say schizophrenia, I'm talking about behavior disorders, because the term does not include children who are socially maladjusted unless it is determined they are emotionally disturbed. Once again, emotionally disturbed is not a phrase that we use anymore, and this quote is extremely old, so let's not use that phrase rather. Classifying behavior disorders, psychologists, psychiatrists always use the DSM-4 here. The DSM-5 is out right now, and it is mostly used. They use the diagnoses factors there. They use that to construct and figure out what are the externalizing and internalizing behaviors the child is having. So once again, as I've said in the beginning of this course, a lot of the terms and phrases that are used in this course are self-explanatory. So externalizing behaviors are the things that you see on the outside, whether it's hitting the chair or punching someone or spitting. I mean, these are the things we see. And, it goes over even in depth, the information here goes over in depth. Uh, exactly what that can look like: a lack of self-control, impulsivity. They can be verbally aggressive, they can be physically aggressive, aggressive towards, other objects or people or animals. And then you have the internalizing behaviors, which is obviously the exact opposite of externalizing. And so I think of the internalizing behaviors as a part of the student's script. And we all have those scripts in our head when you're going into something that's really challenging. It might be a prayer, and then it may go straight into, I've got this, Nicole, you can do this, you've done this before, you can do hard things. It's all of those things. So sometimes you have people who have behavior disorders, and they're not giving themselves that pep talk or, that vote of confidence that they may need. It could be more of I know this teacher hates me, I'm going to fail this test, that person doesn't like me, or she knew I usually sit there, why did she do this? And, it's those things. And so they get caught up in their own thought process, and they will start to reciprocate. And when they reciprocate, they're just going, I'm sorry, not reciprocate, they start to perseverate. And so when you perseverate on something, that's all you think about over and over again. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she sat in my chair. I can't believe she sat in my chair. Now, class may have been at 10 in the morning, but it may not be 2 in the afternoon. Class is over. You've had lunch. You've done all of these other things, but you're still sitting there going, I can't believe she sat in my chair. But she gets in my chair, and it's just the hyper focus on it that keeps you from doing other things. And so that could lead to avoidance, not wanting to go to class. It could lead to withdrawal, not participating in class, compulsiveness, if it's their person's nature. And when I say nature, I mean the behavior disorder manifests its way in this manner. It might be that they end up going in there and, making physical contact with the person, or getting verbally aggressive, or, doing something to change the other person's behavior so that they can get what they want out of it. And so one of the things about the internalizing behaviors is obviously you can't see them, but if it starts to show up in the form of the symptoms of depression or anxiety, once again, it's going to be really important that the adults in the student's life are focused on that. So if you have a child who's normally outgoing and upbeat, or maybe on their phone, making plans, whatever the case may be, and then all of a sudden, they're not. It's like, wait, what's going on? My son, not for once, my son used to love to play the drums, and I think I've shared this story. And at PB Middle, the principal there was really great about integrating individuals with disabilities across every programming in the school. So my son learned how to play the snare drum, and it was great. And he did a really great job with it. And so got ready to transition to Mission Bay High School. They have a band program, and a really great band. They used to have 2 bands. I'm not really sure what's going on over there now. But he, once again, was excited, but the environment was different. And then it became, because they're such a showcase band and they're really, really, really good, the patience wasn't really there for him. So he, got deterred from it. And then here comes the behaviors, because his need wasn't being met, and he couldn't communicate how he was sad that he couldn't still be a part of PB Middle's band, and things of that nature. But so it brings about all those things. It's rarely just that one thing. It's usually behavior shows up, especially anger, as masked sadness. And it took me a long time to figure that out, but it's true. When people act out and they're really, really angry, it's really covering up some kind of grief somewhere, or the feeling of sadness somewhere. And so depending on who they had that relationship with, you have to sit there and hopefully develop the relationship and rapport, so that way you can turn around and be like, well, I know you're still upset because, well, in my son's case, it's like behaviors escalated every time my husband would deploy. The first time he did it, I really thought Caleb didn't pay that much attention to it. I mean, his dad was gone, but it was just gone for a longer period of time. And we were kind of telling the same script, like, oh yeah, he'll be home on this day. And we are trying to keep him busy with stuff. But then when his behaviors escalated at school, and in the midst of him having a meltdown that included him tearing off the pages, the paper off the bulletin board, one of his aides that he just adored, asked, are you sad? Are you sad? And out of the clear blue, he was like, I miss dad. And then he just stopped tearing down paper and like cried his heart out. And I was just like, when you have a child who doesn't have the verbal skills to talk about those deep-seated things that, in some cases he may have had a difficulty with expressing, even if he didn't have severe delayed speech. It's just those things. Like once he got it out, it's like, okay, well, we'll create a picture book. We'll do this. And thankfully nowadays, kids don't have to really deal with that as much because we have such great technology. But back in not that long ago, which is like 2005, 15 years ago, there was no FaceTime and things like that. And so everything was just over the phone. And my son is very much wasn't for talking on the phone. Even to this day, he's not. So it's just those things where when you don't know the script, you don't know what the child is telling him or herself. So it's important that when you start to see these behaviors that you take the time to find out what's keeping them sad, and then understanding that they may not feel comfortable expressing what they're truly sad about. But hopefully you can connect them with someone or put it on their parents' radar so that they can find the time to dig into it, because you don't want that to stunt that part of their growth just because they couldn't get past something that maybe they didn't do well on, or those feelings of worthlessness. When it comes to measuring behavior, you always want to look at the rate, intensity, duration, and if it's an age-appropriate behavior. So the rate is basically, as it states here, how often it occurs in a given time. Intensity has to do with strength and the magnitude of the behavior, and then duration, how long. But when it comes to the age-appropriate behavior, you don't want to turn around and punish a child or give a child a consequence. I shouldn't say punish. Consequence based off of something that is age-appropriate. It is very common to see 2- and 3-year-olds throw temper tantrums. So regardless if the child has a disability or not, they might be throwing a temper tantrum simply because they can throw a temper tantrum. It's very common to see, toddlers do that. That's what they do. On the other hand, it is not appropriate for a 4th or 5th grader to throw a tantrum. It can be kind of appropriate for a kindergartner to do it because depending on the situation, they may not have been exposed to that type of structure. But I would say by the end of September, if not sooner, that temper tantrum, that rate, that intensity and duration should have lessened to the point of no more, because hopefully they got in line. Because if a child continues to have behaviors and can't conform basically to the expectations of the general education classroom, parents, teachers' aides, assistant principals, they start asking parents a lot of questions around, well, can Johnny sit still at home? And how does Johnny do with the schedule? Things of that nature. And I understand Johnny gets sleepy after, after snack at 10. However, things of that nature. Everyone loves some type of routine. As much as people claim sometimes they don't, we crave it in some circumstances. ADHD is one of those diagnoses that can be considered learning as well as a behavior disorder, simply because of the person's inattention. And this inattention can be, sometimes people can look you dead in your eye and still not be connecting. And you can tell they're not connecting because, your eyes are looking at each other, but it's like glossed over, deer in headlights. And for those who have the inattention or the inattentiveness in their brain, think of it as having a book open, like give you a brand new book, turn it, open it, and you basically just start flipping randomly, like quickly. And so that's how sometimes their brain functions. They're constantly flipping through different thoughts. They've thought about traffic today, and then it's like, oh, there was no traffic. And you can be sitting in class talking about the moon. Let's just throw something random out there. And as the instructor, you're standing there talking about the moon and the phases and the la la la. And then the student's looking at you, and you can tell he's looking at you, but his brain might be on moon. Oh yeah, the moon was really full last night. Oh, that made me think of cheese. And then it's like, oh, that really good, Havarti cheese. And then it's like, next thing you know, where did I get that Havarti cheese from? Oh yeah, I got it from Windmill Farms. Oh yeah, and then next thing you know, the teacher's like, okay, are there any questions? And then, the student's sitting there going, yeah, plenty, because all I know is cheese, and now I want cheese. But she gave you the whole lesson on the moon phases. So that's the inattention. And so some students have mastered the ability to sit there with the blank face, and they'll even nod in some cases and say, and, and sure, and things that will give a thumbs up. But they haven't listened. at all. So that's why it's so important to have engaging instruction and also to differentiate your instruction. If we were having class face to face, we would have engaging instruction. But here we are. Hyperactivity and impulsivity, in some cases, people, when they hear ADHD, they think of that. They think of the people who can't sit still, who are constantly fidgeting, who have to get up all the time, and the movement or whatever. And sometimes it does look like that, and then sometimes it looks like inattention. Nowadays, we do not use the phrase or use the diagnosis ADD. Everything now is just considered ADHD. So in the school system, when working with students with special needs, you want to integrate positive behavior interventions. It's quite common, at least it used to be, parents, school teachers would say, no, that's incorrect, or they would lead with the negative. I can't believe you did this. Oh no, and just things that are negative. Well, that has had an impact on a child's development as a whole. And then when you think about someone who has a disability, especially those with behavior disorders, in most cases, they've heard no, don't, stop, like all the negative for so much, they've become desensitized to it. Thankfully, research has shown that positive behavior interventions and supports has been a great and effective way to turn behaviors around. And so you have different levels of prevention. You have your primary prevention, that's basically school-wide programs. It might include Saturday school, after school detention, lunch detention, yard detention, depending on what type of school it is. And then you move from there to the secondary prevention approaches. And these are the people who have, they may be experiencing something that's really, really severe, maybe situationally severe, meaning, maybe they've lost a loved one and now they're acting out because of it. So that would be someone who is at risk for more severe problems, maybe along the lines of depression or maybe even increased behaviors or anxiety. And then in some cases, they may have already exhibited mild behavior problems, in the school personnel as well as the family are trying to figure out what's really going on with the kid. And then you have the tertiary programs. These are the ones where it ends up the student may be removed from the school after so many suspensions. He or she may be in a school that's just for students who have behavior problems. And so now they're really looking at it where your focus is still your education, but it's also in getting you as the student to recognize when you are ramping up, is what I consider it, when you're ramping up to an episode or an explosion of behaviors. And so you're hoping that they can develop self-coping strategies, be able to engage in different techniques to calm themselves down, so that not only can they go back into the integrate back into the general education classroom or the special education classroom, but they're also just able to complete their day without causing further disruption to themselves as well as in everyone else's education for that particular day. So in order to go about, measuring the rate, the intensity, the duration, some students, including my son, have had to have a functional behavioral assessment done. And that's basically when they go back and they grab, if they say, okay, what is Caleb doing? Well, Caleb is punching windows. Well, it's like, what is the antecedent? What are the things that are happening before he gets to the point where he's punching a window? You want to look at the things that lead up to the behavior, and then of course the rate, intensity, and duration, but then what happens after the behavior. In most cases, my son always would end up like crying, like this intense boo-hoo, like from his gut cry. And it's like the sadness, so much sadness there. And it's like, well, is he sad because his need wasn't met before the explosion, and now he's remorseful, because he is a very remorseful young man. But it's like, what can we do to stop it from getting to the point where you destroy something and then you turn around and you're crying, you're so remorseful, and it's like, we do feel bad for you, but we got to figure out what it is that's triggering you. And so it's a functional behavioral assessment because they're trying to figure out basically what strategies that can help to function, be put in place so that that can serve the same, I can't talk, that are positive and replacement behaviors that can serve the same function as the problem behavior. So if Caleb was punching the wall, punching the window because computer time is over, then we need to put in place countdown timers. So that way it's not just like, okay, Caleb, turn off your computer, let's go, because he needs time to count down. So that might have meant putting up a timer or putting up one of the timers that's color coded. Like, okay, it's at green, but now it's slowly fading to yellow. Now when it gets to red, and then that red time, maybe 5 minutes. So even when it gets to red, there's still time for him to still process and click it off. Now keep in mind, my son could easily click it off. If I said, hey Caleb, let's go grab pizza, he'll turn off the computer now and go. It's not that he can't, like he can't mentally process what does it mean to turn it off. No, it's just that he doesn't want to. And so that's where the oppositional defiant disorder comes in, because it's like, well, there's a time set for the computer and we're going to put the timer, like the things. He totally gets it. He just doesn't want to. And so it's that piece, that I don't want to, but no, we have to go do these things. Yeah, but I don't want to. It's that back and forth that is exhausting, to be honest. So then from there, once you have all of that data from the FBA, the school psychologist, the guidance counselor will put together a behavior intervention plan. This is something that is a part of the IEP, and it's usually at the very, very end. And it's so important for parents to be involved in the development of the BIP as well as in the implementation of it, because the positive behavior support strategies that are taking place in the school setting really need to be taking place at home. When they say that the child has an IEP team, their support team, it is truly a team. And so you want people, from a parent's perspective and as the teacher perspective, you want people who are on board and on the same page and are willing to do the strategies and incorporate them, because it helps with what? Generalization. So, and it also helps the child understand that, like I've said before, this is not just something I do in, Miss Sally's class. I also do it at home. I'm also expected to do it at church when I'm in Sunday school. I'm also expected to do these things when I'm with my soccer coach, because everyone has communicated to each other. And when I say that, I don't mean necessarily the coach has talked to the teacher and the teacher's talked to, the therapist. It's usually the parent who's acting as that liaison, because, well, duh, as parents, we are the ones in control of our child and what they do and where they go and who they're around. So I took it on myself to be the one to share all of this information with all of Caleb's, everyone's, from psychiatrist to swim coach to everything. So that way we can all speak the same language. So when I'm not around, Caleb is still hearing the same strategies, the same language, the same approach to his behaviors, because they definitely showed up in all of those settings. Behavior change interventions, you want to always address the inappropriate behavior. Whereas when Caleb was younger, sometimes he would hit to get your attention and be like quiet hands. And so when something is quiet, it's still. So he associated quiet with being still. And then of course he knew his hands. So it's like his hands needed to be still. When you speak, you say, excuse me or hi. You don't just walk up and hit someone to get their attention. It's inappropriate. Then you want to develop appropriate cognitions. So once we understood, Caleb learned his parts of body early, and so he knew where his hands were, as I just said. But then start pointing out what is appropriate, and that comes in handy that would come in handy, I should say, when he was around his peers, because then or his cousins, my nephews, because then I could say, oh, Jaden's doing a good job waiting for his, food if we're at Chili's. Well, Jaden's doing a good job waiting on his tacos, and, just engaging with Jaden, my nephew, about, maybe what did he order on his tacos, because my son, once again, knowing my son is such a mimicker, it was just like, oh, well, he's sitting there with his hands in his lap, so maybe I won't, sit there and hit the table like it's the drums. And so then it's like, well, what's Jaden doing? So it got to the point, the more he spent time around Jaden, he started mimicking a lot of Jaden's behaviors. And so that same, not necessarily praise, but it's like, oh, I like the way you're sitting there, or, thank you for holding the door for me, Jaden. My son used to think it was funny to hold the door, but then run ahead of me and then stand in front of the door to keep me from leaving. Well, if we were at home, that's one thing. doing that at, say, Olive Garden, because he used to really love Olive Garden, is not appropriate because now we're hindering everyone's flow. And of course, we're in public, and it's just like, okay, I think it's funny for like 2 seconds, but it won't be funny if, other people get involved. And then, of course, you want to teach the new behavior, and that can come in reinforcing what you're seeing already being done by someone else. So when it comes to discipline in school, and we're down to our last 2 slides, and I do hope you've taken breaks throughout this because I don't want you to sit for the full time where there's a 20-minute or a 30-minute presentation. But when it comes to discipline, it's important that the school look at how that person's disability is manifested on that student, and if it's something that they can truly discipline the child for. For example, I used the example about Tourette's, and if it manifests its way that causes the individual to yell out curse words, you can't turn around and punish the child for that. The hope is that you could develop strategies that would help lessen the maybe the tone, I shouldn't say tone, the volume of it. But once again, if it's something that can't be controlled by the child, and they've done all they can, then you may have to look at alternate classroom settings, because obviously sitting in math class trying to learn, whatever it is about math, and hearing an expletive from the back is just going to be a disruption to the entire learning environment, whether they're in a special education classroom or not. But you have to take into account what that disability is and how it looks on that child. And then from there, you're going to develop a behavior management plan. And this will be the different ways, different resources within the district, within your classroom, maybe the community can help with hopefully getting the student to correct the behavior through positive behavior interventions. And if it gets to the point where the child has to be suspended, my son has been suspended for breaking school property like windows and kicking desks, bit a teacher, things of that nature, then they move to suspension. Well, children in special education do have a limit of how many days they can be suspended, and 10 is the max. And then from there, the school system is supposed to start looking at alternate settings. And that might mean them going up there temporarily, or it may mean moving there permanently, or at least until the end of the school year. And so in those cases, the student is basically there. They're once again focused on correcting the behavior. If the intellectual ability is there, they may be about them talking about what caused the behavior, and they'll bring in the parents, of course. They want to know what the home life is about. I mean, it's a whole thing, because if you are in the general education setting, your goal is to ultimately earn the high school diploma. If you are in special education and you're not working toward the high school diploma, you're still working towards a certificate of completion. So that's why you're at school. And so if you're doing things or engaging in certain types of behaviors that's keeping you from doing that, or keeping your classmates from doing that, then an alternate setting is the next discussion. And that is chapter 8.